This question deals with crumple zones and is question 7 on the higher paper and 9 on the foundation paper. Now, with these 6 mark questions, it's important to realise that lots of them are targeted at different grades. So this one is targeted at a grade C level. And very often there'll be a series of points you've got to make that form the basis of the answer. But then there are 3 levels that you can answer at. So the easiest parts to understand are the points, and then we'll talk about the levels afterwards. So the question is, modern cars are built with larger crumple zones than older cars. Explain why large crumple zones are more effective than small ones. The quality of written communication will be assessed in your answer. So in other words, even though your science points might be really good, if you don't present them in a sensible way, then you won't get all the points. So, what points can we make? Well, the easiest ones to understand are the safety points, and lots of people made these, okay? What the crumple zone does is increases the safety or reduces the harm to the people in the car, and it's damaged itself to do so, okay? So that's the easy bits to get. You've then got to talk about the science. Well, whenever you're talking about reducing the impact force, right, which is one of the points you've got to make, some people did make that point, okay, that they make the occupant safer by reducing the impact force. It's always a trade-off with time, because if the car is moving, it's got a certain amount of momentum. When it stops in the crash, that's a fixed amount of momentum you've got to remove. Okay. Now, it's perfectly okay to refer to equations in these 6 mark answers. So if you look at the point here, it says because force equals momentum change divided by time. If you go back to the formula sheet here, change in momentum equals resultant force times time. So that's just rearranging this equation, okay, to get resultant force is change in momentum divided by time. What that means is, right, because the change in momentum is fixed, we can't do anything about that, right? We want to try and reduce the force as much as possible to keep the occupant safe, and the way we do that is by increasing the time, okay, because resultant force times time has got to be this change in momentum number, going from moving to stopped. So if we increase the time, we reduce the force. And that's a general principle that works for crumple zones, airbags, seat belts, all these things that increase the amount of time you take to stop will decrease the force. Okay? So that's one way to describe it, okay, mentioning these sort of points at the top here. You could also say that it increases the distance, the stopping distance for the passenger. Okay, there's more to crush, it says at the end of that. That's a fairly basic point. It's quite generous of them to give it to you. The other way to think about this question is in terms of energy instead of momentum. So you could say the car's got a certain amount of kinetic energy, which we've got to get rid of, right? And one way to do that is in putting that energy into crumpling the crumple zone. So you've got 2 arguments you can make. You've got the increased time, reduced force argument, and the kinetic energy has to be got rid of. Larger crumple zones absorb more energy than smaller ones. So those are the key sort of science points, the ones written here. And then if we look at which level you can get, so we'll just scroll across now to look at the levels in the mark scheme. Okay, when people are marking these, they tend to look first of all at which level you've got, and then sort of decide between the 2 marks in the level by how good the points you've made are. So level 1 here, so 1 to 2 marks, describe the safety aspect with little or no explanation. Lots of people were at this level, okay? Some of you recognise that force or impact had something to do with it. You talked about the fact that it reduced the risk to the occupants of injury. That's very basic stuff which will only get you 1 or 2 marks. Now, getting up to 3 or 4, you have to make some actual science points, okay? And it's quite generous here because it's targeted at C. It says the science may not link directly to the safety aspect. So you could talk about the fact that you're reducing the impact force, and then you could talk about the fact that that makes it less likely for the occupants to be injured. Those 2 things aren't really linked, right? But if you sort of did that, you'd be looking around about 3 marks there. Okay, it says, and there may also be some incorrect science. So you don't have to get things perfect to get to 3 or 4 marks. And if you can get 3 or 4 marks on every 6 mark question, you're actually doing pretty well. If you remember the grade boundaries for the papers, for higher tier in particular, if you're getting half marks, you're looking at B's and A's. Okay, so getting 3 out of 6 on a 6-mark question is nothing to sniff at. It's pretty good. Okay, for the very highest mark, you've got to mention multiple different points. Okay, multiple scientific points of what happens in the crash. So you'd have to have several of these bullet points mentioned. Okay, for the 3 to 4 marks, 1 or 2 of them mentioned, and they don't necessarily have to join up in a nice logical argument. Okay, so the key general points to make here when you've got these 6-mark questions is these levels often depend on what the questions ask you to do. Okay, here it says explain why larger crumple zones are more effective than small ones. Well, there's no obvious separate tasks to do here. Right? Sometimes it'll say describe and explain, and if you just do the describe part, you'll be at level 1, and you'll need to get the explain in to do level 2 and 3. But the general guideline is to make as many separate points as you possibly can, and not just write one thing down, which lots of you did. Right? You really have to think about what separate points you can make. So it's really important that you try and redraft your answer, right, using these science points, because just the process of writing down the answer using these ideas, or some of these ideas, should help you to understand more about how to answer these sort of questions. And this one is a really common one. Okay, so if you get the same question in the exam, instead of crumple zones it says airbags, pretty much all the same points apply, right? If instead of crumple zones it said seatbelts, again, fairly similar, pretty much all the same points apply. So you've got to recognise and look out for these things, and use the practice that you've done to apply them to new ones. So really try carefully to redraft your answer to make sure you include much of this stuff as possible.